Okay, so we're meeting today to talk about the psychological structure of fascism by George Bataille. So we just started talking about homogeneity and heterogeneity. Should I give like a pretty quick summary of the essay?
It would be wonderful.
Okay, cool. I mean, I'm basically probably just gonna go off of like the notes that I already shared, but at least for parts 1 through 6, and then I can go through parts 7 through 12. I just finished those. So he talks about the big thing here is, or sorry, he starts from Marx, whose theory is that the economic base or material conditions of a society produce the superstructure or the social formation. So through the modes of production, you get the state itself. You get I believe you get courts, police, the military. Basically, everything that sits above the economic layer is produced as a result of the economic base, and it feeds back into the economic base. So it needs to reproduce its own conditions of production. So Bataille takes that's sort of where he starts off, and he takes an approach to looking at like the structure of the state from a slightly different angle. He talks about the homogeneous and the heterogeneous. So the homogeneous is the part of society that can be assimilated, or, Fran, like you said earlier, conforms. And through it, everything is done for a reason. So everything is like utility. It's a means to an end. And the measure of that utility is money. And then you have it's not quite the heterogeneous society. He calls it heterogeneous elements. And these are the parts of society that can't really be brought into it. And everything in heterogeneity is not a utility. It's not productive. It's just things for themselves. So we can think of like thinking back to his earlier essay, like eroticism and saintliness and violence and stuff like that. So the homogeneous society is basically this mixture of like capitalists and then very like wealthy proletariat. And the heterogeneous elements are the very, very, very top and the very bottom. So it is like the very poor proletariat, those like working for a wage, and then also the king, or basically like the royal power is not part of the homogeneous society. And so the homogeneous society is unified, but it's constantly sort of being destabilized and requires like protection. And so that's what the purpose of the state is. So to Bataille, the state is sort of a mixture of homogeneous and heterogeneous or sovereign elements. So an example of a heterogeneous element would be like the king in charge of the state. So in a democracy, the state sort of adapts, and in a despotic tyrannical, the state is more of like authoritarian. And so the state is able to fight against these external threats, but it can't do anything to fight against internal disruption. So like Marx says, the economic conditions produce a contradiction, and this leads to class struggle. And there's nothing that the state can do about that. So this is sort of the internal breakup of homogeneous society place. And so if it does break up, then these sort of like formerly more savvy operators of homogeneity sort of become absorbed by the heterogeneous. So you can think of like capitalists that are, sort of, they have their finger on the pulse, will end up sort of joining this, like once they realize the ship's going down, they'll jump off and join the other force. And so he sort of compared. Oh yeah, sorry.
I'm wondering a question. Is there an implication of like a cyclical nature to homogeneous and heterogeneous societal elements?
So how do you see that playing out?
Like a sort of a homogeneous society having some sort of break, which then invites these heterogeneous elements in, and those elements perhaps define the new homogeneous element. I know that. Yeah. I think I'm a little astray there somewhere in terms of like the two not being turned one into the other.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and he covers that in the second half, and I'll get to that pretty quickly. So he talks about the and again, this is sort of just the last half of the notes that I shared. He talks about like heterogeneity as having sort of a sacred structure. So it sort of, heterogeneity operates according to more of like a magical or imaginary logic. And so it uses concepts like, what is pure and what is impure, as opposed to like what is useful and not useful. And so this plays out with fascism because it operates according to the logic of pure versus impure. And so when confronted with heterogeneity, or rather, anything that is like pure or impure, taboo, or mana, the opposite, like a decomposing body, people experience an affective reaction. So this is like an emotional reaction, which doesn't happen as part of homogenous society. So like there's nothing very emotional about, working 9 to 5. And this, people are either attracted or repulsed to it. These heterogeneous elements are either, are seen as like dynamic and charged, whereas homogeneity is kind of boring and static. And so people who are not unified can end up being unified through heterogeneity, but they can't be unified through through homogeneous society, like the promise of making. So these external heterogeneous elements can create unity, whereas homogeneous society can really only maintain it. And this is what fascism is. So fascist leaders are heterogeneous. They pursue power for the sake of power, not as a means to an end, and are able to unify by sort of pitting the pure versus the impure, or pure against the impure. And this works pretty well for homogeneous society because there is already this sort of division of the rich versus the poor, and the rich want to oppress the poor. And so they can kind of work together to identify both the poor and the impure and then collectively oppress those. And so this binds together homogeneous society and heterogeneity in a way that makes homogeneous society beholden to heterogeneous elements in order to like maintain the unity. But the heterogeneous elements are not really beholden to homogeneous society because they don't really need any reason for existence. They just exist in and of themselves. And so this kind of creates this like new model of the state where you have sort of a king or like a royal power that ends up sitting at the top that is heterogeneous, but effectively like binds and stabilizes homogeneous society. So that's parts 1 through 6. And I can be a lot quicker with 7 through 12. Did anybody have any like questions about that part?
No questions. I really appreciated your notes. I'm curious to learn about the other half of this essay. I'm not as familiar. I'm not saying that. I'm a little ashamed to say thank you, Mike. And one thing I really liked is where you say fascist leaders are heterogeneous and that they pursue power as an end in itself. I think the implication there is power is useful. And that is the sort of implication here. The figurehead, the king in charge being used as a tool by homogenous society to unify.
Yep.
I don't know. There's an implication there about power, almost destructive.
Yeah, I mean, you can think of it as like a standing army doesn't really do anything. It's powerful, but it doesn't have an effect if it's not being utilized.
Yeah, good point. It's like our American bases all around the world are not a money efficient, venture.
Eddie,
I guess that depends on the.
Yeah, so they would be our bases would be part of homogenous society through the military because we in a democracy.
It's certainly part of the global.
Yeah, because we don't. I mean, I think it feels this way sometimes, but we don't currently live under a fascist dictatorship, which is almost maybe even a little bit more invisible that way than neoliberal homogeneity.
Something at the end that like we're not a fascist society because we own like the democratic quote unquote societies are not fascist only because they don't even care to rebel or something like.
Yeah.
Like we're too hopeless to even be fascist.
That's basically the last. Yeah, that's the very last section. But
sorry
that's
for skipping way ahead.
No. Did you read the whole thing?
No, I skipped through.
Okay, cool. No, I can't hear you.
It was a little hard. It was a little hard for me because in a certain sense, like I mean, he's just saying like, well, like there's the normal kind of way of things, but then there's like the outliers that don't fit in. But it didn't. I guess it seemed a little because there's also the issue he kind of brings up that it's like your emotions themselves are heterogeneous, like within. Not just like within like the larger frame of things, looking at like the societal perspective, is there, say, homogenous, heterogeneous, like even within the self, within each person, there's homogenous, heterogeneous, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I might respond that like, it's not necessarily the emotion that's heterogeneous, but rather that we have an emotional reaction to something heterogeneous, which would be external to the self. But I guess that sort of depends on how you think of emotion. But I think, yeah, you're right that there is sort of this, and I think he sort of describes that too, where he talks about the unconscious as being sort of this like internal heterogeneity, this this thing that just exists in itself that doesn't really do us any good. So yeah, you're right. That is kind of, it's hard to say what the clear delineation is between homogeneous and heterogeneous. I can go, why don't I just go through 7 through 12 and we can kind of just go back to any of them and dive in. So leaving off on sort of now the king sits atop, or this royal authority, they become not really independent. He talks about sort of the rise of the king as being, the product of society. So like kings are crowned by already being the head of the military in a lot of cases. In this case, when he talks about fascism, he says that fascism is really able to unite all these heterogeneous elements together. And so what it produces in the form of like the army is this like heterogeneity within homogeneity. So this is, Fran, what you were sort of talking about, the cyclical nature, where like if you look at an army, you have like basically nobility, you have rank, you have division, but at the same time there is this unified whole. And the way that this works is because each individual is emotionally or like religiously connected to the head of the army. So they basically, he describes each individual soldier in a fascist army as being pretty, what's the word he uses? Wretched. But then they attain a sort of personal glory through identification with the king. So the king sort of cancels out that wretchedness and makes them sovereign. He provides them with this like imperative, this like order. So he's going to talk a lot about imperative versus subversive. So sort of an imperative is like feeling like you have to do something. And so the king, by ordering people to slaughter, sort of makes them sovereign. So if you think back to the earlier Bataille essay, the erotic exuberance one, you know, sovereignty is this this willingness to place oneself into violence and chaos of continuity. And if you can imagine a soldier being given orders to kill people, they are being made sovereign by this head of the army, and effectively they become sort of an extension of the chief's body. And so it becomes this sort of homogeneous structure, which at the same time preserves the individual heterogeneity. So it's basically, it acts as one, but it is made up of individuals. And this happens, or this is maintained through each soldier still having above them the distinction of they're being bound by like honor and duty. So this is not what happens in homogenous society. You have the capitalists that don't really have any, you know, morals or anything above them. And the soldiers themselves are still underneath something. If it's not ideological, it's the head of the army. And then he talks about religion. So the other kind of key component to, oh, sorry.
About that, can I ask a question?
Oh, yeah.
So it sounds to me almost like you could say fascism smooths all bumps, right? Like if there is a particularly wretched soldier, a fascist society might excuse that soldier's actions. And maybe that's what differentiates it from
yes.
From, you know, it's almost like the conversation happening news stream all day, right? Like about whether or not a police officer would be held accountable for something. Would you draw a correlation between conversations?
Yeah, totally. Like homogenous society requires giving up to sort of be the lowest common denominator, a pursuer of money, whereas heterogeneity sort of fascism embraces difference and is still able to unite it without requiring conformity.
As long as you hail the king.
Right. Yeah. Maybe we could say it preserves sovereignty and still forming. Yeah, that's a really good call out. So I guess, yeah, you could say that the more fascist elements of society would be the ones that are more supportive of a extrajudicial killing, willing to look the other way. So that's
so long as it's by those higher up to those lower down.
Yes, the pure versus the impure. Yeah. Can't kill a white guy in America.
Oh no, you can. They just have to be
yeah, they have to be poor. Okay, so that's one half of fascism, the army. The other half is sort of this religious power. So it's a marriage of the two. He talks about how back in like Rome and Shintoist imperial cults, the head of the army was also the head of the church. The ultimate head is God himself or itself, and God to Bataille is this image of heterogeneity in homogeneity. So it's basically a transcendence both. He kind of gets into it. It's a little, he goes into Hegel, and I'm really not, but then chapter 10 is fascism as the sovereign form of sovereignty. So he talks about how fascism he talks about the Islamic Caliphate, which was not fascist because it never actually had a state, even though it was a perfect fusion of military and religion. Fascism sort of requires a state to springboard off of. And the reason is because the rise of fascism, there's a first stage of fascism, which is sort of like this rise of fascism. And that is, like Fran, you were talking about earlier, power in itself, that it doesn't do anything. So it needs to be seen as a bridge to some larger thing. So fascism needs to rise in order to do X. We can't just have, this marriage of the military and religion taking over. It has to be seen as like the first step towards something. What it's really good at doing is it takes disparate classes and unifies them, which is something that socialism can't do. So socialism, just has the proletariat, which needs to become conscious and revolt, whereas fascism can take all sorts of different elements of society and it still unifies them. So and unlike sort of royal society, like sort of this traditional aristocratic society, fascism welcomes and incorporates the very lowest classes. So fascism always has to be formed within a state. And then he talks about in the last, the fascist state, fascist Italy versus fascist Germany. And so they sort of took two different approaches. So Mussolini conceived as sort of the magical sort of element that acts as an imperative force as the superior personality and sort of the will to power, the man who is, able to take what he wants. And Nazi Germany, on the other hand, was their magical sort of heterogeneous element was race. And so these were two different approaches, but they both work. And he sort of talks about how Mussolini didn't really distinguish himself from homogenous society, and that's because he completely seized the state. But at the same time, he was not a product of the homogenous society. He got most of his power not from being head of the state, the president of the Italian Council, but from being Il Duce. And same with Hitler, derived his power not necessarily from being chancellor, but from being Führer. And then in the very last chapter, I promise I'm getting to the end, in order for, this is the best one, the fundamental conditions of fascism. So this is what I think, Fran, you were saying earlier, is that there needs to be this fractioning of homogenous society for fascism to creep into. So, and homogenous society is good at that because we have contradiction leading to class struggle. We have a division of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And this creates the necessary infighting for fascism to come in. There's sort of two forces operating within the proletariat. There's this subversive socialist force, this reaction to, but there's not really before fascism an imperative force. Nobody's really demanding that the proletariat do anything, and that's where fascism comes in. Is it introduces this imperative force, and given the choice, people will choose the imperative over the subversive. And so when fascism comes in, it squashes the class struggle, generally in the favor of the capitalists, although in Italian fascism, the capitalist class was not totally helped out. And so this kind of seems to contradict Marx, where we think that the economic base, the conditions, produce all social formations above it. So democracy, fascism, socialism, everything like that comes first and foremost from the relations of production, which would be the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But in fact, it was the economic base that created the conditions allowing for fascism to come in the first place. So we still have Marx's central thesis is preserved, that it is the economic base that allows for fascism.
Well, if I understand Marx and Hegel, it's kind of like a reciprocal process.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not just a one-directional.
Yeah, and I'm not really sure how fascism reproduces its own condition.
I don't think it's exactly worked right so far.
Well, I think in a lot of cases, fascism does sort of marry itself into the corporate structure, where like the fascist leader is effectively the CEO, and the capitalist class is largely preserved. So I think in that sense, the social formations are reproduced by, they reproduce their own.
Yeah, but I mean, one aspect of capitalism, what Marx expected in it was dynamism, was the fact that like everything can change. And I mean, it's the good and the bad side of capitalism, and in a certain sense, I mean, it's like, to the degree I understand fascist seems like, just like let's stop right here, like let's just keep things as they are, whoever did well in the past, they'll just, stay where they are. Everyone will keep doing the work they're doing, don't want anything different.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's also the element that's unifying across lots of like fascist societies in history, which are like, you will achieve glory if you are on our side. There's something, they always dangle some sort of carrot in their people, and usually it's a very spiritual carrot, glory or like closeness to God or something along. What do you think?
I'm trying to think of what
short term in the future. Sorry, there's the historic bend, and then there's also a little bit of like a future bend also.
I'm trying to think of what was the longest running fascist state. Like, are they generally pretty short-lived because they need constantly to be fighting something, and if they run out of things to fight, then they sort of collapse?
I mean, at this point, is North Korea? Like, North Korea's been around for so long.
Yeah. I'm not sure is North Korea's Juche fascism? I have no idea.
Well, do they have classes?
Oh yeah. I mean, I guess the thing with classes is like,
I mean, they're not communist.
By what?
Yeah.
By what frame or standard? Like, how do you define the classifications? Like, I mean, they technically have a system of production.
Right.
They have some who determine that, who does what, and some who don't get a say.
Well, who owns the means of production? Is it individually held or privately held? Or is
I think technically it's held by the Kim family, but I mean, the thing with power, is it's always a little more varied than just like whose name's on top.
Mm-hmm.
You always need some amount of others who have some say. Like there's no, again, that's the thing with like the absolute king and like the focus on the like the heterogeneous king. It's like, but do they really have, are they really heterogeneous,
Mm-hmm.
Because like it almost sometimes seems, if you look at history, that like the nobles just like one step below are a lot more heterogeneous than the person on top.
Mm-hmm. Like they have a lot more individual freedom.
Yeah, and they essentially, the king's very much beholden to them, at least historically.
So I looked up North Korea's system, and they have something interesting, which I feel like is relevant. It's a class system called the Songbun, and basically it's 3 classifications that are divided based on how committed you are to the cause. So there's the loyal. There's the wavering class, and then there's the hostile class. And they've totally twisted the meaning of all of those words at this point. So basically, if you're an enemy, if you're deemed an enemy of the state, you're thrown into that hostile class status and punished as such. And if you want to be rewarded, like let's say you smuggle a bunch of drugs in for the leaders of the party, then all of a sudden you get promoted into that loyal core class. It seems to be the structure.
Wow, that's a really crazy approach to class.
Yeah, I agree. It's very. I would argue that feels like I don't know. Maybe I'm like using the word too loosely, but that sounds like fascism to me.
Well, I guess it would be interesting to look at how the Song or the Kim dynasty arose. Did it arise through unifying heterogeneous elements, or did it arise from like a socialist revolution that sort of went the way of the Bolsheviks and became like Stalinism?
Yeah, that's what this Human Rights Watch article says, is that this class system directly contradicts the Constitution, which is a socialist constitution that claims everyone's sort of like on equal footing.
Hey, well, welcome to America.
Yeah, I think that's just
welcome to
the state.
Yeah. Or human society. We have ideals that are not met.
Yeah.
I want to the very last page of this was super interesting. I just want to go tell you guys about it. So you know how fascism sort of comes in through the cracks? Well, those cracks can often be created by the socialist attempted subversion or attempted revolution. So in a lot of these cases, fascism is a reaction to the subversive socialist movement, and it comes in as a competing one. So you sort of have these 2 competing revolutions going on. And I think that's sort of what we saw in fascist Spain, where you had sort of this anarchist faction, you had a socialist faction, and you had you had an anarchist, a Republican, and a fascist faction. And so in all these cases, Bataille is saying the fascism tends to win out because the imperative force is able to capture sort of these disillusioned bourgeoisie. So basically rich people breaking off from homogenous society and joining fascism in a way that the subversive socialist uprising can't, because it really only draws from the proletariat. And so once the socialist uprising begins, the fascist uprising begins in response, and then outpaces and dominates it. And so he ends the essay with sort of this call for us to better understand and anticipate social formations and understand what the imperative call is, and how to predict it, reason about it, engage it in dialectic in order to prevent it from taking over and overriding the subversive forces, which are the ones that can actually emancipate. So in order to have a socialist revolution, we need to understand the appeal of fascism.
So that really sort of makes me think, because that sounds like bringing strategy to the table.
Mm-hmm.
And a question on my mind is, is there a place for strategy in heterogeneous elements that might disrupt a homogeneous society? Like, is it almost antithetical to heterogeneous disruption to have any strategy whatsoever? Like, are we just sort of doomed?
Well, I think one thing to keep in mind is that the proletariat is not part of homogeneous society for the most part. They are allowed to work in homogeneous society, but they're not really given a seat at the table. And so they effectively are heterogeneous. What?
Well, I mean, I guess the thing is that just because they don't own the means of production doesn't mean that the means of production don't rely upon the prolet. I mean, that's the whole point of the proletariat, or the reserve army of labor, is that you need workers. Like, capital needs labor. You need labor power. You need human work to be done towards some productive end. The whole point is you just don't want them deciding what they're doing. You know, you want to have a clear delineation between who's the boss and who's the worker. But like a boss without a worker is nothing, you know?
Yeah, I guess I was just responding more to like what Fran was saying about, you know, evaluating strategy of heterogeneity. I think we could still have praxis and like strategize without it necessarily becoming fascist. I'm not sure if that's what you were saying, but
I think I was trying to ask a question. Is there a place for strategy in heterogeneous? Sorry, can someone pronounce that word out loud quickly?
Heterogeneous.
Heterogeneous, thank you.
It's honestly, however, heterogeneous.
Yeah.
Same with like you can say homogeneous or homogeneous, you know?
No, I demand conformity. You have to say it a certain way.
I'm just going to imagine a hyphen between hetero and gene.
Yeah, who's the most loyal to these podcasts or whatever? You know, we gotta start ranking.
Yeah, you got to use proper English.
Mike will decide who's.
I mean, there's some great people out there who would argue that linguistics are the source of oppression.
Oh yeah, totally. I think even Foucault, like when we were reading that, would say the biopolitics of language. But sorry, when you're saying room for strategy within heterogeneity, what type of heterogeneity are you talking about? Like, are you saying as like sort of more like socialist leaning heterogeneity? Or are you talking about heterogeneity in the generic?
I do think that there's the socialist hue to every part of this part of defining heterogeneity. I really am having a hard time separating this reading from the present moment right here now. And I don't know if you chose this reading, Michael, because it does feel so relevant. But, we have this very splintered left coming from so many perspectives with a sort of socialist idea somewhere in there, whether or not it's explicit across the board. I think everyone wants a more social, on the left, they want a more socialist society. But you sort of see it playing out in real time right now that the strategy is just garbage, right? Like there's a total inability for anyone. Every time that someone tries to step in and get everyone on the same page about something, that sparks yet another conflict.
Well, I think you could use his language to say that there is this subversive socialist force, and it's being challenged by this competing imperative force of like, I'm, Jewish and I see, blasted on the news, black people attacking Jews. There's this like all these riots in like the 80s in New York that created a lot of tension between, the African-American population and the Jewish population. And that acts as an imperative force, which counters the subversive force, or which overrides this like subversive anti-capitalist force. And so I think, you could maybe use that language to describe why there is this fracturing of the left, and it's maybe through the introduction of imperative forces, possibly into. Anyway. But yeah, I think it is super relevant to today, especially because if you look at who is uniting on the right, it's just so many different groups of people. Like you have the Trump people, you have, Trump is probably the uniting force, but you have like Patriot Prayer, Proud Boy, like the Western chauvinists, you have the conspiracy theorists of QAnon, you have the nationalists of Make America Great Again. And all of these people are sort of brought into this umbrella ideology of Trumpism or rightism, and I think that is really the power of fascism.
Don't forget the famous evangelicals who held their nose and voted for whatever.
Yeah, that was really brave.
This clap that did the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see that Trump wasn't more religious than he was, because if he was able, I almost feel like if he was able to truly fuse religion and the military, then that could have been the ISIS or the
sealing the
deal.
Yeah. Well, then the question becomes less about homogeneity and heterogeneity and more about just like people with conviction, with morals, people who stand by their values versus people, why it sounds to me like there's basically fear on one side, right? Like fascism is born from fear.
I would say fascism is born from like a combination of love and fear. So okay, sorry. Could you go on about that? Or?
These different minority groups who unite under a sort of Trump style fascism. I'm sure there's correlations to like the 1930s that we could find. They unite. They put their values to the side because they're afraid of how much power they're losing. So in this country, right? But they have a strategy in the homogeneity.
But what about a lot of these people that never had power? Like, aren't a lot of the fascists pretty poor, and they are proletariat who are oppressed by a homogenous society? I guess one definition of fascism, or maybe just conservatism in general, is it's like the imagined outrage of having acquired power and then losing it. And And so it doesn't necessarily tie it to a real power structure, which is why you can get conservatives, you can have very poor people with, reactionary fascist views that don't really stand to lose anything from a socialist.
Well, I mean, Mike, especially when we think about, like, let's say racial power shifts in America. Like, I mean, that's been one huge boon to, like, poor whites, is just knowing you're, like, always better than, or that it's how do you call it? I don't think people want to necessarily rise to the top, but they certainly don't want to fall to the bottom. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's one huge motivator to, like, American fascists, or, those who are certainly leading that way, is they just like, they like being one rung up, at least.
Yeah.
Or just always having that bottom rung reserved for someone who's not them.
Right. Yeah, I'm trying to think of how that works in Bataille's project, where I guess if you conceive of yourself, you can do that if you're very poor by still conceiving of yourself as pure, like with Nazi Germany, through like race, something that is maybe not, well, race is a bad example in America because it is a they call it a mode of oppression, but, like, I don't know, let's say that there was some imaginary, truly imaginary way that you could establish yourself as pure and others as impure, then you're able to satisfy this, like, sadistic, I don't know. He talks a lot about psychological structure, but he keeps it pretty cursory, I think, on, like, talking about, like, what it means to, like, have sadistic, like, tendencies, or yeah.
A quick question: what was in Mussolini's approach to fascism? What was the purity? What made someone pure? Do you know?
Yeah, so his approach was different than Nazi Germany in that it wasn't about race; it was about, like, the will to power, and he saw within himself the superior personality, the embodiment of the nation. So through the strong-willed person, the nation state of Italy was made sovereign.
So the more Italian you are, the more national you are.
I think so. Yeah, the more nationalistic you are, the more you can see of yourself as an expression of that sovereignty, of that national, as opposed to, like, the individual sovereignty, more traditional fashion.
That makes sense.
I'm trying to think back to what Walter Benjamin's. It was such a good last section on explaining what fascism was, but it's been a little bit of this.
Oh yeah.
I don't know. Eddie or Nathan, did either of you guys have anything that, I don't know, you sort of came up in your mind as we were talking about this or going through it, or any, like, tangents or side thoughts?
I guess it is interesting to me, just that idea that we just don't even care to rebel, anymore. So, like, you don't need, so it won't prompt the exact, like, fascist response, or at least in the original sense of fascism. I mean, our current, like, at least, it's always hard for me to call it fascism because I don't see it exactly that way. I'm not sure what it is, with Trump and, the reactionary right. I don't even know.
Yeah, I mean, fascism is a very nebulous term, probably kept intentionally obfuscated, so it's harder to spot and counter. But I almost wonder if you could be super tinfoil hatty about it and say that, the neoliberal order introduces these imperative forces into the proletariat to override the subversive socialist ones, and does this not just to prevent the rise of socialism, but also to prevent the counter rise of fascism. And in doing so, it two birds, one stone, it preserves itself. Although Bataille's theory is that homogenous society is not capable of preserving it.
Well, I mean, I guess you think about, like, the body as, like, a homogenous, I guess, to use his terms or whatever, homogenous just seems to be like the order as it currently works,
mm-hmm.
But, like, there's no immortal,
mm-hmm.
just because that order is still composed of human beings, which are themselves individually,
mm-hmm.
Have their own individual heterogeneity.
Well, I think maybe he would say capital is the because he says,
I mean, capitalism is what relates human beings together, or at least to the degree that we are or live in a capitalist world system. That we are related through capitalist or through capital relation.
Right.
But I mean, we're still human beings. We're still living creatures. It's not like capital is the only way in which we can or have ever been connected or related to each other.
Well, I mean, if you want to go full Marxist, you would say that ideology is the result of economic conditions and would be determined by one's position in relation to the mode of production. I don't know that I completely buy that, but if that were the case, then one could say that, the bourgeoisie, as owners of the means of production, are deterministically going to be capital oriented first and necessarily homogenous and not individuals. Well,
but I mean, I guess I always think about the Zizek had he was making some Hegelian or Lacanian point. I kind of forget, but it just kind of struck with me. It was like a village or something, and you asked like certain villagers like to like draw a map of the village, and it was like, this like sort of circular expanding, like, oh, everything's connected, like all the houses, like you have the center and then the outer, they're all part of a whole. And then you ask like essentially lower class villagers to draw a map, and you get a very clear, like, here's where we are, then here's where we don't go. You know what I mean? Like here's where we're not allowed. Whereas like for the upper class, it's like, oh, everything's a whole, So there's a certain perspective in the sense of like, who is part of the whole, like it's a lot easier to see everything as like a harmonious whole when it benefits you.
Well, that reminds me of, oh, sorry.
No, I was just saying it's a lot harder to see things as like some glorious, perfect system, when it crushes you every day and the life out of you.
Yeah, I mean, if you remember the second, maybe third chapter of Society, the Spectacle, the quote talks about two becoming one versus one becoming two, and two becoming one is bourgeoisie logic. And I think that ties to what you're saying, is that bourgeoisie has this tendency to seek a oneness, a harmoniousness of everything, and the proletariat is constantly faced with division and contradiction.
Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting to me how humans never reach a point where they're comfortable enough that they can like be okay with like we're bad or something, like no matter how bad you are, you always kind of want to feel like you're doing good or like you're in the right.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know. It's just amazing to me how, the wealthiest people in our country and in the world, just love having an army of like sycophants to just, praise them. I think we're probably the same. I shouldn't exempt myself from this.
Well, I'm thinking back to like Machiavelli, and like, I think there's this sort of tendency that one reveals themselves as, Machiavellian or sociopathic, that people come together to counter it. And so there has to be this facade, like Elon Musk has this facade of like, helping humanity, get off the planet or some bullshit. And that's necessary. Otherwise, they would be directly attacked. And maybe they even internalize that. It's become like this evolution, there's been like a natural selection of sociopaths. The one that were too obvious about it, were removed. And there's become this like, I don't know.
This layered approach where you have to.
Yeah. And you're not even aware of it.
You can put on.
Yeah, right.
See, I don't believe Elon Musk. Well, let me put it this way. I think the facade Elon Musk puts up, he puts up to himself as well.
Right.
Like this is a guess, but I don't believe that Elon Musk sees himself as like conning the rubes or whatever. Like I think he's fully invested, in himself and in his own idea of himself as well.
I mean, I think it's willful self-deception, but yeah, I mean, I think he does practice it, that he would not admit, consciously that he is, pursuing himself at the expense of everybody else.
I would add there's possibly even some natural selection built into our societal system, the structure of our system, where distance is embedded between the problematic people and the people who they are oppressing, right? So, for example, all four of us have distance from like the slaves that make our clothes or whatever. We don't feel it. We don't feel like we are oppressing anyone because there's been so much distance built into the system. I would argue it's not really intentionally built in. But it's been naturally selected into place, right? Like any system where I had to physically whip people in order to get my clothes has been killed off. And now we have this great system where it gets shipped on giant boats around the world. So
I think that's what Marx was talking about with the fetishized commodity, which is that the commodity encapsulates the social relationships that produced it. And as such, it sort of possesses this magical power to us, where we see it as not just the thing in itself, but also the social relations that produced it. And I think maybe it's necessary that there is some distance. Like if, my neighbors work together on a thing and I watch them all day build it, well, maybe even there's still some distance. But yeah, I mean, I do want to say that maybe there's more of a magical power the further away it comes, the more foreign it is.
I can see that. I'm trying to relate also to Elon Musk, who maybe in the lie that he tells himself is partially due to the distance he has from the people who he might be oppressing.
Yeah.
I mean, I love that idea of the embedded magical, magic that's in an object if I watch someone build it. Whereas I don't know about you all, but if I find a nice chair on the side of the road on trash day and I bring it home, holy shit, that's my favorite chair. I can sit in it guilt-free.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah, I still remember that earlier meeting we had.
What, Fran's $12,000 couch?
Well, if we're straying far enough away from the original reading here, I wanted to ask on the subject of socialism. I recently heard an interview with someone named Richard Wolff. Is anyone familiar with that name?
Oh, yeah.
He's a
guy.
A contemporary Marxist economist.
Oh, he's married to somebody also.
Talks really slow and emphasizes his point.
So his wife is a Lacanian psychoanalyst. But sorry, what about Richard Wolff? Yeah. What about Richard Wolff?
Well, I thought something that he said in an interview was very interesting, and where he defined socialism not as an alternative to capitalism, but as a critique to capitalism. Mm-hmm. And I don't know about you all, but when you go way back and you read some of the founding Enlightenment work, it's really inspiring, and you're like, oh, they were trying to create a system that avoids fascist people from entering it, right? And first of all, I'm by no means like well read in this, but I wonder if you all know where Marxists sit on the Enlightenment. But secondly, Richard Wolff spoke about how socialism is just the next iteration. It's like, great, capitalism worked for us for a little bit, now it's broken. So here's this great critique of capitalism. It's not that we're trying to like revolutionize the system. We're really just trying to make it work again because it's broken, which I thought was a very compelling way to frame socialism.
I like that a lot, Fran. Actually, if you could send me that, I'd be interested in hearing that because
it was on a podcast. It was on Planet Money.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Well, I will say this. It's how do you call it? Like when you're when you're selling, like you gotta kind of boost up. But at the same time, it's like the real aspiration of communism is an entirely new set of social relations. Is like how can we relate to ourselves outside of market transaction? So it's not exactly honest or true that like you don't want to overthrow capitalism. I mean, I don't know. Maybe Wolff doesn't anymore.
I mean, we might find that money is not the only way of producing contradiction within society. If you look at Stalinism, power created haves and have-nots as well, independently of money.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, contradiction, I think that's inherent to human beings. I think we will always live in some amount of contradiction. I think maybe that might just, be an aspect of our existence. I guess the thing is, how do we transcend our current problems that result from, the wage relationship?
Yeah.
I mean, again, like Marxism itself is a critique of capitalism that has no answers for this. It has like maybe an idea of where to look, or at least an idea of why things are the way they currently are. But
have you read?
It is limited.
Have you read Althusser?
No.
I just read his essay, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, and he wrote this in like the 60s, right before the French student riots. Anyway, basically like within a year of Guy Debord. And what he did was he said that Marxist theory wasn't, it was like his Marxist theory of the state, that like you have the infrastructure, the economic base, and then you have the superstructure, the social formations, and then you have, this cyclical reproduction of both, was still languishing in this like descriptive phase, that it wasn't really able to command that we do anything, because all it did was describe what exists. And in order to sort of like jumpstart this theory, Althusser added to it by basically modifying Marx's version of the state, splitting the superstructure into two parts side by side. And on the left, you have what he calls like the repressive state apparatus, which is, the courts, the army, the government, the administrators. And on the right side, you have the ideological state apparatus, which is church, school, family, like all these para, like I guess, how would you describe them? Not employed by the state, basically these other like apparatuses in society. And those two things working in conjunction are what reproduce the conditions of production. He didn't really, it was unfortunate because I might have read an abridged version of it, because he sort of ends it there, and I didn't really get the sense that it launches into an answer for how we can resolve the contradiction posed by capital, of the contradiction of class struggle. But I guess I do sort of feel that like Marxism is, I don't know, I mean, it doesn't quite hold this like scientific property for me, where like it hasn't been able to predict what happens after capitalism. Like, you know, Russia descended back into, you know, Bolshevism, or descended into Bolshevism, not communism. And plenty of other examples. Not to say that Marxism is bad or wrong, but I find that like through the last 150 years, we haven't really gotten a lot of like empirical data points of it having this like very immense predictive power of what lies beyond.
Oh yeah, no, not at all. I mean, that's the thing is I mean, in a certain sense, like you have to aspire to something more. Like humans have to want something, you know? It's not like it just happens, you know what I mean? Like, it's not like, yeah, I guess it's not that we're just on like a train going, you know, what is it? We're not just taking what is that? The historical inevitability of communism or something? Yeah. You know, are you familiar with that idea of like,
no,
like, like communism is essentially inevitable. Like there's no other way but forward towards communism. Mm-hmm. I mean, you've heard that idea, right?
In some form or another. Is that Marx?
Yeah, this sort of. I think it's like a certain interpretation. That's like when you talk about like the kind of religion. It's essentially like it's almost like a certain religious side of it's the religious aspect of communism, or you know, the idea that
utopianism.
You know, just keep pushing ahead and it'll eventually lead towards communism. Mm-hmm. You know, like we'll eventually get there if we just keep going in that direction. I think that motivated a lot of the Stalinist or like Russian state.
I mean, I could see that acting as an imperative force, to use Bataille's language, because I feel like right now, if all there is a subversive force, like, you know, the proletariat, the conscious proletariat that wants revolution, wants it in reaction to being oppressed. They want it to, you know, bring the top down and bring the bottom up. Then where do you go once you've had revolution? You know, you don't necessarily have anything that you're driving towards. You're really more of reacting to. Whereas an imperative force like this sort of communist utopia is, you know, sort of the gasoline, I guess. That.
Yeah. I mean, again, I personally, it's very similar to that, you know, the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. You've heard that, right? Mm-mm. No, it was like, I think it's a Martin Luther King quote, you know, and Obama brought it out a lot, you know, that, you know, the world, you know, is becoming more just. It's just like a tendency of the world to be more just.
The idea is that we're getting somewhere. We're getting somewhere perpetually.
Without having to do anything. That's how some people interpret it, I feel, is that we don't have to do anything. It'll come, you know, it's inevitable that it'll come.
I kind of almost want to challenge the idea of using history at all. I think that, and I would also apply this to this sort of like utopian idea of like the primitive hunter-gatherer and this like return to nature or return to monkey, where it's like the past it's like a separate category. It's like not something that ought to factor into the present conditions. Like it factors into our conception of our present conditions, but I don't think that it like, okay, so like let's say 20,000 years ago, people lived in like, you know, harmony as hunter-gatherers in these very small tribes. We're past that point. Like that's just no longer an option. So to use that sort of reasoning in where we should go from here feels to me just like a logical like error. And I guess I would make the same argument towards like, is the universe becoming more just? I think that is almost like a separate thread. You know, I don't think that it's one that would or can factor into what our present conception of justice. But I don't know if I can define it.
I want to clarify, I think what Nathan was saying is using is the universe getting more just? He was using that as a similar stance as perhaps the communist Russia had, which was if we just keep being communists, eventually we'll achieve good communism instead of the crappy world we live in now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's almost like it takes away the moral imperative from us, where there's the active agency. The active agent is the universe, not the concerted effort of individual. So it's almost like it's utopian in a sense, but it's not utopian in a way that leads to praxis.
Right. Or it's pretty much like it leads to just do what you want. It'll happen anyways.
Yeah. I think there is an adjustment to be made in like the world we live in now, where it's, you know, the driving force is selfishness, right? Like it's like don't ever dare think of others. Otherwise, it doesn't, I don't know, that's my perception at the moment. Selfishness at all costs.
I mean, I think it's sort of like when we were talking about Guy Debord, it's like all of our communication most of our communication is facilitated through money. And so anything subversive gets dropped. Like, we just don't notice the people who are not selfish. We notice the people that are selfish. And so there's this sampling bias, I guess, that makes us think that, that's how the majority of people are. But I think that if we're aware of that, then maybe we can have some optimism about our fellow countrymen.
I can buy that.
Although I do know some incredibly selfish, unfortunately selfish people.